Hello, I'm James Holland, and in this series exclusively for History Hit, I'm going to be looking at armoured fighting vehicles of the Second World War. And in this episode, I'm looking at the legendary Red Army's T-34.
The T-34 was launched in 1940 and is one of the most famous and iconic tanks ever built.
This is a T-34 85 model because it's got an 85mm gun. The original one had a 76.2mm gun, so this was upgraded in 1943, first reaching the front lines in the spring of 1944.
Designed by lauded Russian engineer Mikhail Koshkin, this tank became a bedrock for the Soviet Army during the Second World War. A staggering 84,070 T-34 tanks were built, making its construction more numerous than any other.
By May 1944, Russian factories were producing 1,200 of these a month.
2.7 metres wide, 7.5 metres long, 2.1 metres tall, it weighs 32 tonnes.
Big turret, quite a low profile.
Everything about this tank screams efficiency and functionality.
It's spare, it's lean, it's mean, and it's an incredibly effective weapon.
Joining me to assess this incredible armoured machine is American academic and former US cavalryman Waitman Beorn, and we're in for a treat. So durable was the T-34 that it saw active service around the world for more than 50 years, from 1940 until long after the end of the Cold War.
There's an old adage about aircraft that if it looks right, it probably is right. And I think you can certainly say that with this tank. It just looks like it does what it says on the tin. It's completely fit for purpose. So this is a real proper battle veteran. Well, Waitman, it's great that you're here because not only are you a former cavalryman, you're also an academic and an expert on the Eastern Front and that kind of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets later call it. And you know, isn't it amazing to be standing by this machine, this just such an iconic tank, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think is really important when we think about tanks, you know, beyond just how cool they are, that kind of thing, right, is they're really a primary source that teaches about the history of a time,
right,
the people that created it, the people that rode in them, that employed them, and also the nation that came together. And I think we'll see things as we move forward that sort of indicate the different approach to war, to production of tanks that we'll see from the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, the history of this and the origins of this, I think, are really, really fascinating because, you know, in the 1920s, the Red Army is emerging from this period of revolution. You know, it's kind of wants to update its military. It wants to have tanks. That's the way forward. You know, so they send out people on these kind of fact-finding missions, don't they? To Britain, to the United States, and out of that comes first of all the T-26, which is based on the British Vickers tank, and then you've got the Christie suspension, which is invented and developed by this American engineer, Christie, and that is what you've got on the T-34, haven't you?
Yeah, and you have lessons that are learned and unlearned, right, or not learned, I suppose. So, you know, there are quite a number of Soviet armored theoreticians who go to the Spanish Civil War,
right,
and they learn there the lesson of anti-tank guns and that they need protection. But what they don't learn is how to employ the tanks.
Right.
They don't learn the tactics that are going to be effective. They're still wedded to this kind of infantry tank support role. And they're going to have to relearn that as time goes on.
So this is really being developed in kind of sort of 1939, 1940, isn't it? That's when it gets the go-ahead. This design by Mikhail Koshkin, he's the head of the design team. And it's completely revolutionary because, you know, tanks in the early part of the Second World War, they're pretty small. This is a complete sea change.
When one is designing a tank, right, it's always a compromise between speed or mobility, firepower, and protection.
Right.
And every tank that we talk about in history and every designer of every tank in history has had to confront that dilemma. When you increase the armor, you make the tank less maneuverable. If you increase the gun, you may also do the same. You may also have to decrease the armor to compensate. And so it's always trying to get that formula correct.
Right, because the more armor you've got, the heavier it is, then you need more power. It gets more complicated internally as well, because suddenly you've got to have an engine that can move something very with a huge amount of maneuverability, but which is incredibly heavy. The bigger the gun, the bigger the turret, the bigger the hull, and so it goes on. You know, it's a complicated business. There's no kind of sort of right or wrong on this, is there, particularly?
No, and one of the things that I think that you pointed out already is that there's always a lag in the production. When you make these changes, even when you have sort of basic changes, that becomes changes with ammunition, changes with even fuel sources sometimes, engine changes, and there's a lag from the moment when you realize we need to make a change to when you can actually incorporate that. And one of the things that's, I think, great about this tank is it incorporates in its most basic design the potentialities for adjusting to the changes. The story of this tank, I think, is in a lot of ways the story of industrialization and mobilization of industry for war. You know, the fact that this tank is even able to be built is often as a result of the movement of over 1,300 factories, completely to the other side of the Ural Mountains.
Yes, which happens following the German invasion in June 1941.
Right.
So this is already in production, and the production numbers to start off with of the T-34-76 are, you know, they're okay, they're decent by most people's standards, but they're not on that kind of enormous scale that you see later on in the war. And as you say, then comes Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, and all these factories just move 600 miles and more to the Urals. I mean, it's an incredible undertaking.
Absolutely.
And once those factories start springing up, the rate of production is just absolutely mind-blowing, isn't it? I mean, 1,200 of these, the T-34-85, a month by May 1944 is just astonishing, isn't it? They're also using the kind of American principles of the assembly line, aren't they? You know,
absolutely.
You do this bit, you do this bit, we'll kind of glue it all together, you're good to go. Off, you know.
This is not an artisanal tank.
No,
right? Like, this is
no.
a mass-produced sort of.
This is mass-produced
supermarket tank.
Yeah, and even just looking at it now, you can tell that, can't you? It's kind of pretty rough and ready.
Yeah, I mean, this tank, to my mind, is about function.
Right.
It's about, does it work, and is it good enough, right? Because often we talk about how perfect is the enemy of good enough, and I think that's kind of the analogy to the Nazis versus the Soviets, right? Which is, the Germans want to create the perfect tank, you know, with all the bells and whistles, and the Soviets are happy with one that basically does its job.
But also they understand that numbers count.
Yes.
You know, you can have your super duper tank, but if you've only got 1,000 of them and you're coming up against 84,000 of these, you know, that's never going to be enough. You can literally overwhelm your enemy by sheer weight of numbers. And that's just such a battlefield advantage, isn't it? Those crucial moments, weight of numbers really counts.
And it's the recognition, I think, that comes from the first days of Barbarossa, where, you know, only 60% of the actual existing tanks were operational.
Right.
Right. And so one of the lessons that I think the Soviets probably learn is that maintenance is important.
Yes.
Right. And if you have the greatest
ease of maintenance.
An ease of maintenance. If you have the greatest tank in the world, it doesn't do you any good if the engine breaks or the transmission goes out.
Right.
And so, you know, these tanks are also designed to be basic, to be simple.
Well, that is the problem with precision engineering, isn't it? The precision engineering is precise, and so any kind of deviation from that precision, and it doesn't work. Whereas if you've got a bit of wiggle room and it's kind of a bit rough and ready, and it's not as necessarily effective as that precise bit of engineering, but it can be more durable, then that's going to count in somewhere like the Soviet Union with its vast open spaces with its extreme weather conditions, you know, huge heat in the summer, sub-freezing temperatures in the winter, snow, mud, rain. You know, you need a tank that's for all seasons, all weathers, all conditions, all landscapes. And this does that, doesn't it? And it's interesting, you know, the T-34 76 was a pretty effective tank, but the T-34 85 is a response to the arrival of Tigers. Tiger tanks and Panthers on the Eastern Front. It's like, okay, we need something with a slightly better gun. First 85mm gun that comes in, you know, it's got a velocity of around 792 meters per second. That's pretty good. But then they kind of improve it again, and by that time it can do 1200 meters a second. You know, that's 3,600 meters a second. That's 3.5 kilometers, you know, that's, yeah, what's that? That's 1.5 kilometers a second.
Absolutely, and it comes down again to the fact that the basic model of the hull has a turret ring that allows for a larger or different turret.
Right.
Because you have to have a larger, different turret to put a bigger gun in it.
Right.
And that way you don't have to redesign the entire vehicle around a gun. You can
Three-quarters
pop
of it
a
is
turret
absolutely
in
fine.
with a new gun on it, which is a huge advantage.
Yeah.
Because anytime you redesign the hull, there's a host of follow-on problems with engines and everything else. But if you could just drop a new turret in,
yeah.
and also by the way with maintenance, if a turret gets knocked out and that's all that's knocked out, you can drop another turret in. The larger the turret gets, the more complex it gets, the farther a vehicle has to go to the rear to be fixed, and the longer it's out of the fight. And again, when you're talking about a simple design that can be put back into action more quickly, having a good enough tank in the field is much better than having the best tank broken in the motor pool.
Absolutely. What I love about this is it's just so unfussy, isn't it? There's no kind of extra frills and spills. This is just really straightforward. You know, if you want to get into the engine bay, which is obviously here, you've just got to unbolt things. This is on a hinge here, so you can just pull that back. It's really simple. So it's that point you were making, Waitman, about easy maintenance in the field. Just looking at this is just not a big drama. It's not a big job at all, is it?
No, I mean, it has access to everything that you need. And one of the keys, I think, at least in my experience as well, you know, if you want a well-maintained tank, make it as easy as possible for the crew to do as much of the maintenance as possible.
Right.
And that means that the crew, you know, you don't need to have special training as a mechanic to get at a lot of the parts. And you see that here, you know, with the engine compartment, as you mentioned, other things, you know, like the tow hooks that are already just built on, you know, hardcore welded into the hull, so that the vehicle can either self-recover, help recover other vehicles, be tied down on a train. I mean, this is another one of these really important sort of larger perspectives, is that this vehicle is also designed to be easily transportable on mass transit, right? To get on it, because you have to get it, because Russia's large, and so you have to get from place to place on a train. It fits on a train car.
I mean, it's just so rough and ready, isn't it? I mean, there's no wasted time. That's really roughly welded on, you know. Don't make it refined when it doesn't need to be. This is all about numbers, isn't it? It's an absolute numbers game. Just churning these out as quickly as you possibly can and getting the most important bits right.
We look at places like the turret, and you see these marks from the cast of the turret, and that you can almost imagine in a factory, you know, pouring the steel, the metal to make this, and they haven't wasted any time. They've cut it off right here.
Yep.
And they don't need to, you know, polish it and make it pretty. You know, as long as it comes out of the mold properly, you know, it's serviceable. If you compare this turret to other World War II tank turrets, you know, this is the future.
Right.
I mean, this is what tanks look like today, more or less.
Yeah.
You know, if you think about moving on to, you know, the M48 Patton, or, you know, some of the earlier British tanks, or the M60 American tank. I mean, like, this is cutting edge in the sloped armor, you know, places for the rounds to bounce off, to deflect in a way that, you know, the German tanks are very angular.
Right.
You know, very straight up and down, very vertical, which is not ideal.
We've got to look at the track and wheels. I mean,
Absolutely.
you know, it's 5 double wheels, the Christie suspension behind it, the 2 drives. I mean, it's all, well, the single drive at the back and then a kind of runner at the front. It's just super simple, isn't it?
Interesting choices again being made, right? So the Christie suspension, if we compare that to even some of the German tanks or the more modern tanks that have what's called a torsion bar suspension, one of the differences is that all the springs are actually inside the crew compartment.
Right.
So what it does, and we'll talk about this probably when we get inside, is it decreases the space inside the tank itself for the human beings. But it's also a much simpler system of suspension for the actual working of the vehicle, which I think, again, if we think about the tank as historical object, as historical source, it tells you, again, a little about what the designers are prioritizing.
And then if you go to the front, it's, again, it's got this sloping armour, this sloping sort of glasses on the front, and it's kind of, what's that, 90 millimeters thick. Again, this is a driver's hatch, so you can have that down with the periscopes or up. Single machine gun, you know, it's just so functional. Again, the towage hooks on the front. And then in sharp contrast, you've got the 85 millimeter gun, and you can see this is beautifully engineered. You know, so the bits that absolutely need to be perfectly engineered are, the bits that aren't.
You know, you can just unbolt the mantlet and pull the gun out of the front. And actually, in some of earlier versions of other tanks other nations had, you actually had to bring the gun or parts of the gun out partially through the turret or through the back of the turret, which is just insane if you think about it. But again, if you're in the field and you have to do maintenance or you have to replace a gun, you can just unbolt it and pull it out. And I think these things are really important because, you know, the fighting and the top trumps of tanks is always something that people like to talk about. But, you know, we used to joke that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics.
Right.
And the logistics is how quickly can you put this back into action? How quickly can you repair it? And what is the mileage on this? How far can this go before breaking on its own? Because one of the things that you have to realize when we talk about tanks is that tanks break tanks by themselves, just because they're so heavy that any long distance of traveling means that, you know, they have a certain limited lifespan before they just break on their own.
Well, let's have a clamber in. I've got to say, this looks pretty straightforward to get into. Certainly compared to some of the bigger, later German models. Now, I can see already that this is quite tight, Waitman, and it's pretty straightforward if you're supple and you're small. But if you're 6'3" and not remotely supple, getting in and out of this has its problems.
And of course, we're imagining, you know, what happens if you have to do this in a hurry?
Right. I'm trying to, all these seats are kind of they're sort of spring loaded, so as long as you sit on them, they go down. But well, the first thing you notice is just how small it is. It's really cramped. And don't forget, this is the T-34-85. So what the 76 model was like, I hate to think. But the second thing I noticed is there's no cage. So in most other tanks, you'd have a cage, and that just moves around with the turret, and you would stand in it, and you're all a self-contained unit, and your driver and your co-driver, lap gunner, are separate at the front. But this, you're all in it together. So that's fine if I'm the gunner, because I'm on a seat which is attached to, you know, which is obviously moving around with the turret when it rotates. Mm-hmm. Commander here
also be able to move with the turret.
He'll be able to move around, but the poor old loader. I mean, crikey. What?
The loader is doing this weird dance of like running around the gun. And of course, you would never be where I am right now, because this gun would come back every time you fired the main gun, and it would injure or kill you.
It's going to just crush you, isn't it?
Exactly. And there's no guards here, even if you were standing, you know, on this side to protect the loader.
Well, no, for the gunner, it's. I mean, you know, there's not much room for maneuver. You just slightly move your elbow or something as that's coming back.
Absolutely. This is a dangerous vehicle.
And these are obviously all kind of sort of shell racks here. So again, your loader is having to kind of pluck them from behind you, from here, and as you say, skip around as the turret is rotating and hope he's in the right position. And more importantly, hope that he's out of the way when the gunner actually fires.
Absolutely. And I mean, and a lot of this comes down to training, which is something we probably should talk about as well.
Yeah.
Because if you have an inexperienced commander or gunner and they fire when the loader is not in the right position, they can injure or kill him.
Right.
And one of the things that's really interesting is that, the tank crewman in the Red Army got 8 weeks of basic tank training.
Yes.
And then was moved, literally co-located by the factory to do a little bit more training while the tanks are being produced that he's going to actually be in.
Right.
And then once you get 10 of them, they go on a train and they join a battalion someplace.
Right.
Which is wild if you think about it.
Yeah, isn't it?
Because usually you think about a replacement or a trainee joining an experienced crew. But here you have entire units, company-sized units, being made up of new people.
This is a tank where the state that is producing them doesn't really care about the lives of the men it's putting in them. Not really.
The soldier exists to serve the machine. And
Right.
I think that's kind of the mentality of the Red Army is, the soldier exists, the tanker exists to maintain and to make this into a weapon.
Right.
And his safety is secondary to that.
That is absolutely clear from just standing here in the turret of the T-34-85.
And I mean, and it also has tactical issues as well, right? Because we know that behind us right now is a radio.
Right.
But when these first came out, only the company commander had a radio.
Yeah.
And the rest of it was basically formation driving, if you will. Kind of imagine, a squadron of planes flying in formation, except these are tanks and they're doing it by flags.
Yeah.
And eventually they learned, hey, it's a good idea for us to have radios, in more tanks. But again, in the initial period, it was get as many of these things to the front as possible.
And also the pragmatism extends to the driving compartment, and you can see there in the driver's seat, you can see the pedals. There's a clutch, there's a brake, there's a throttle. It's like a basic car system. There's gears, there's a gear shift lever on the right hand side, just as you'd expect. There's levers rather than a steering wheel. So you're basically effectively braking one side of the tracks to maneuver from left to right. But it's really basic. So anyone who could drive a car can drive a tank. So Waitman, as a kind of former cavalryman and tank man yourself, I mean, what do you think it would have been like for the crews of that?
I think it's important to realize that a lot of things haven't changed. Inside of a tank is very busy. There's a lot going on. The tank commander is giving the driver instructions, potentially the gunner instructions, potentially looking out of the turret for what's going on, potentially talking on 1 or 2 radio nets. So it's really busy.
And a lot to think about if you're the commander.
There's a lot to think about. You're also maybe trying to navigate in terrain that you're not familiar with at the same time as also making sure your other tanks are where they're supposed to be.
And watching all the time, because danger could lurk anywhere.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're always looking out for all kinds of different things. It's loud, it's noisy, there's crew chatter. I mean, it's controlled chaos inside that turret.
I mean, here it comes now. I mean, just imagine if you're an infantryman here, you're dug in defending the farm behind us, and that's coming towards you.
I mean, there's
pretty intimidating, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a relentless sort of ominous churn of tracks and engine that is coming towards you. There's probably others around in a real world scenario. And if you don't have the right tools to stop this, I mean, it's just futile.
Yeah, and I guess what you need is experience and skill, don't you, really?
And a certain level of grit, I guess, to sort of stand there, to stand in the breach and know this is coming towards you, and hopefully you're confident enough in your abilities to stop it.
Right.
But otherwise, there's a thing that people refer to often as sort of this tank fear, where it's coming after you, and there's almost an irrational sense of fear.
But I think you must also felt quite vulnerable yourself if you're in a tank. I mean, there's a story of Lieutenant Alexander Oskin of the 53rd Guards Fastov Brigade. And this is during Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1944 on the Eastern Front. And he gets ordered to go into this Polish village called Ogladov. He's supposed to link up with the second company of his same tank unit. And when he gets there, he can see, just as he's approaching the village, he can see German troops coming in from the other side of the village. So he thinks, okay, well, I'll kind of close in and I'll kind of watch what's going on, and hides himself in a cornfield, hull down, just the turret out, and just watches. And these tanks start to, these German troops start coming in, and he just watches and watches and watches. Night falls. It's the 11th of August, 1944, and he just stays where he is. And in the evening, as night is falling, a company of Tiger tanks, Tiger IIs, so the Königstiger, the King Tiger, that have only just come into action, they suddenly appear on the scene as well. And so he thinks, okay, well, I'll just wait and see what happens. So on the following morning, it's the 12th of August, 1944, Oskin's still in his cornfield, and suddenly he sees 3 King Tigers. So he waits until they're 200 meters away and then fires at the second King Tiger in the row. Thinks he hasn't hit it, but in fact he actually has. The shell has penetrated the turret, and lets off another couple of rounds, and Judy starts to smoke, by which point the first King Tiger is kind of, the barrel is swinging round inexorably towards him, fires off another shot, and it hits the turret ring and immediately starts to burn. At this point, the third King Tiger thinks, well, I'm having nothing more to do with this, and starts to reverse out and back out and try and get out of there as quickly as possible. But the T-34 is far more maneuverable and nimble than the mighty King Tiger, and he soon manages to catch it up and get behind it and do the kind of fatal coup de grace up its backside into the engine bay. And that's 3 King Tigers knocked out. And I think that's the only occasion in the entire war where one Allied tank destroys 3 King Tigers, not Tigers, King Tigers, in one single action. It's quite a feat.
Yeah, and it's a great example as well as tactics over technology, right? And someone that knows how to fight his tank and knows how to maneuver and to employ the strengths that he has against the weaknesses of the enemy. Because one might say, that the King Tiger was technically in some ways superior, but if you know how to fight this particular vehicle, you can clearly take out at least 3 of them at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Waitman, look, it's been brilliant having you here. Thank you for your expertise and your knowledge and helping me kind of come to terms with this incredible tank. And also thanks to Dan and Ollie inside the tank for driving and maneuvering it. It's been a fantastic day.
And thanks so much for having me and letting me sort of relive my glory days of being a tanker. It was great.
Well, I think this is an amazing tank. I really do. I mean, in terms of numbers, you simply cannot beat it. 84,070 T-34s built, 48,950 of the second edition, really, the T-34-85 like this one. I just still cannot get over the fact that they were producing 1,200 of these a month by the summer of 1944. I mean, that is just extraordinary. It does what it says on the tin. I love the fact that it's just so rough and ready. It's so basic. It's got no frills, no spills. It's got a really powerful gun. It's got decent armour, 90 millimeters at the front. That doesn't make it the best tank in the war by any stretch of the imagination, but it's pretty good. On the other hand, it's if you wouldn't want to be a crew in here. I mean, it shows that the Soviet Union treats its manpower not quite with disdain, but not much more. I mean, they're basically cannon fodder. And there's so many things that can go wrong in this tank for you as a crewman. There's so many things where you can bang your head, cut your forehead open, knock your shoulder, your elbow, your knees, and that's before you've even come into contact with the enemy. So it's a very, very difficult environment in which to operate. On the other hand, ease of maintenance is also extremely good. It's very basic, very easy to kind of keep going in the field, so that's very much to its credit. But overall, awesome though it is, incredible design though it is, you wouldn't catch me fighting in one of these, not for love nor money.
Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel, which we are relaunching. We've got all the best exclusive content going straight onto this History Hit YouTube channel, and you can find out, for example, why on earth I'm standing at the top of this mast. You should probably subscribe.